It started with dust, the kind that floats like memory lazy and golden in slanted light. I had gone up to the attic because the bulb in the hallway had flickered one too many times, and I needed to find that old box of spare light bulbs we used to keep near the holiday ornaments. Funny how something so small can lead you somewhere you hadn't planned to go. I pushed aside a lopsided cardboard box labeled winter coats, in my old handwriting faint, now barely clinging to the masking tape, and there, nestled beneath a patchwork quilt we hadn't used since our daughter was a toddler, was the green tin. My fingers recognized it before my eyes did. The wedding fund jar. Not really a jar, but an old tea tin with a rusted lid and a faded sticker that used to say, Earl Grey. I had kept it hidden for years, tucked away behind layers of life, both literal and emotional. I sat down on the floorboards that creaked with the weight of both age and memory, and I opened the tin. Inside there were no coins anymore. I had moved the money long ago to a savings account, something with more interest and less temptation. But what the tin held were folded scraps of paper receipts, little notes to myself, one or two yellowing photographs, and a crumpled grocery list, where I had once scribbled, "Remember, it's for her smile. Keep going." I remember writing that. It was a Saturday morning. She was still asleep, and I had just returned from the bakery, after choosing the cheapest loaf of bread, passing on the pastries. There's a kind of ache that comes from remembering how tightly you held your dreams, especially when you had to hide them even from the people you loved. Back then, I believed the surprise would make it more special, that if I could give her the wedding she dreamed of, without asking anything in return, no credit, no applause, it would be a final radiant gift of motherhood. My husband used to say I had a saver's soul, but he said it like it was a flaw, like I was stingy or joyless. He never understood that it wasn't about the money. It was about the intention behind it. Every dime I tucked away was a thread in a tapestry I was quietly weaving for her future. The wedding fund wasn't just financial. It was emotional, a secret tribute to every macaroni necklace she made me, every kiss goodnight, every time she called me mama and ran into my arms. But the attic didn't just hold warmth, it held weight. Cobwebs draped across the rafters like silent reminders of all the things I had deferred. Trips I didn't take, dresses I didn't buy, dreams I folded up and tucked away, telling myself that maybe later. There was an old mirror leaning against the far wall, half covered by an Afghan. I pulled it back and looked at myself just for a second. The light caught the silver in my hair, the lines around my eyes. I didn't flinch. I didn't smile either. I just looked. It was strange. I had gone upstairs for a light bulb and found a box of memory instead. But I didn't cry. I think the tears had dried up long ago in quiet increments, like a lake evaporating without anyone noticing. I just sat there holding the tin in my lap and let the silence thicken. What startled me most wasn't the tin. It was realizing how long it had been since I'd thought of it, of her, of myself. My life had become about running the house, feeding people, staying out of the way. My name was more often forgotten than spoken. I was Mom, Grandma. Hey, could you or did you see my... But I couldn't remember the last time anyone said, "How are you?" and meant it. I had buried a version of myself in that attic, one who used to dream, to plan, to believe that love looked like sacrifice, and that sacrifice would be repaid with tenderness. But sitting there in the attic light with the smell of dust and old cedar in my nose, I felt something shift, not big, not loud, but like the first crack in a dam. A thought. What if no one ever asked me to give that much? What if I just did, hoping they'd notice? The attic was still. No one called for me. No one even knew I was up there. And for the first time in a very long while, I realized I didn't feel lonely. I felt alone. There's a difference. Loneliness is wanting company. Being alone is just being with yourself. And I realized I had missed myself. I started the wedding fund before she even knew what a wedding was. Back then, she was just a chubby-cheeked little girl who loved to twirl around the living room in a tutu, declaring she was a princess. I never corrected her. Why would I? That little imagination was everything good and pure in this world. And I remember thinking I want her to feel like that on her wedding day. Magical. Whole. So I began saving. Quietly. Steadily. Not in large sums, no. We didn't have that kind of life. We were never poor, not exactly, but we lived in the kind of way where the fridge was full only because someone worried enough to plan carefully, stretch creatively, and deny silently. That someone was me. The first $10 I put in the tin came from skipping lunch for 3 days. I told myself I wasn't hungry, and I wasn't lying, not to them anyway. Hunger had become a background noise by then. You get used to it when your joy comes from feeding others first. It felt like a trade, a noble one. A little less for me, a little more for her future. I kept the tin in the cabinet behind the canned beans. No one noticed it. No one asked, and I liked it that way. It was something I did not for applause, but for purpose. Every month I found ways to save. Turning off the heater in spring a little earlier than comfortable. Choosing the off-brand shampoo, patching old curtains instead of buying new ones. Every time I dropped a folded bill into that tin, it made the softest sound. But to me, it was thunderous. A declaration she will have something beautiful one day. When she was 15, she fell in love with lace. We were walking past a shop window, and she stopped in front of a wedding display. "That's my dress," she whispered, pressing her nose to the glass, like a child still chasing fairy tales. I remember how her eyes sparkled, not because she had a boyfriend, not because she had a plan, but because she still believed in that kind of joy. That look etched itself into my heart. That was the moment the saving stopped being just a habit. It became a vow. My husband knew I was saving for emergencies. That's all I ever said. He didn't ask details, and I didn't offer them. He never asked where the money came from when we needed car repairs or a new washing machine, but he also never noticed when I chose not to buy a new coat in 3 winters. He just assumed things worked out, and I made sure they did. I always did. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I think I imagined the reveal. The day she'd announce her engagement, and I'd quietly hand over the savings. Maybe in a little envelope. Or maybe I'd make a scrapbook out of the old notes. I kept tiny confessions of how each dollar was saved. I pictured the tears in her eyes, the way she'd hug me, maybe even thank me in a speech at the wedding. Foolish dreams, maybe. But they kept me warm during the years I gave so much of myself and received so little warmth in return. The funny thing is I never saw it as sacrifice back then. It was just what a mother did. I grew up in a world where love was not shouted. It was sewn into seams, stirred into stews, and saved up in silence. When our daughter turned 25, I moved the money to a proper account. I had saved just over $14,000 by then. It startled me seeing it all typed neatly on a statement. I remember sitting on the couch holding that paper and whispering aloud, "You did that." And for a moment I felt proud, not just for the amount, but for keeping a promise only I had ever known about. Of course, time passed. The economy shifted. She started dating someone I wasn't sure about, but still I kept the money untouched. When she'd mention wanting a big wedding or worrying about the cost, I would just smile and tell her, "You'll be okay, love." And in my mind, I'd already imagined paying for the venue, the dress, the flowers she always adored. Peonies, I think. But recently, that dream has started to feel brittle, like an old leaf kept too long in the pages of a book, something delicate that might crumble the moment it's touched, not because of her, but because of everything else, because of the way I've started to disappear in my own home. I don't think anyone realizes that I haven't bought a new pair of shoes in 5 years, that the sweater I wear most days is older than our youngest grandchild, that the medicine I need I sometimes skip, spacing the pills farther apart just to make the bottle last a little longer. And yet I've kept this fund pristine, sacred, untouched. But what happens when something sacred becomes invisible? When your care, your love, your effort, yourself becomes a given, expected but no longer cherished. That's where I find myself now, wondering whether this fund is still a gift or a chain I forged around my own heart. The jar may be just a tin, the account may be just numbers on a screen, but to me, it was a lifetime of maybe one day. And now standing here, I'm starting to wonder whether one day already passed and no one noticed. Sunday dinners used to be sacred in our house, a kind of weekly ritual where roast chicken meant comfort and mashed potatoes meant forgiveness. It was the only time we all sat down together, and even when the children grew older and their lives busier, I still clung to it, like the hem of a well-worn apron. Every Sunday I'd rise early warm, the oven marinate the meat, and hum softly as I kneaded dough for bread no one truly thanked me for anymore. It was habit more than hope now, but still I did it. That particular Sunday the house was louder than usual. The grandkids were bickering over devices. My son-in-law was watching sports too loudly in the living room, and my daughter was scrolling her phone at the counter while I basted the chicken for the 3rd time. I remember the smell, rosemary, garlic, lemon, and the way it clung to the air like a lullaby only I could hear. I called them to the table. No one responded the first time. By the 3rd call, they came grudgingly. Plates clinked, chairs scraped, laughter came in bursts but not directed at me. I sat at the head of the table as always, though it felt more symbolic than respected. And then somewhere between the green beans and the first slice of pie it happened. My husband was talking to our son about finances, something about tightening belts, cutting back, being smarter about the future. And then he chuckled without even looking in my direction and said, "Honestly, it'd help if I didn't have an extra mouth to feed." I don't know what stung more, the words or how casually he said them, as if I were a burden, a line item in a budget, as if I hadn't spent decades making sure everyone had more than enough while I quietly made do with less. The room went quiet for a beat, but not the kind of quiet that rises in defense, the kind of quiet that means no one wants to get involved. A few awkward chuckles, a shrug from my daughter, and someone changed the subject to something meaningless. No one looked at me. I stared down at my plate. The chicken I had roasted so carefully sat untouched. The mashed potatoes made from scratch, because I knew my grandson didn't like the boxed kind, suddenly looked bland and gray. And in that moment I realized I wasn't part of the family. I was part of the furniture. There was a time he called me his girl, a time he brought me wildflowers from the roadside and slipped his hand into mine during movies. But those days were gone, faded, like the ink on the letters he used to write me. Now he barely noticed if I was in the room, except apparently when tallying up the grocery bill. I wanted to say something. I opened my mouth, but the words clung to the back of my throat like old dust. What could I even say that I wasn't an extra mouth? That I was the reason his shirts were always folded, his pills always refilled his dinner, always warm. It felt too small, too petty, and far too late. So instead, I smiled. I forced it, tight at the corners, polite in the way women are trained to be. Then I picked up my fork and quietly chewed. The taste didn't matter. The warmth had long since left the food. I washed the dishes alone that evening. He sat in the recliner, drifting in and out of sleep, with the TV glowing blue across his face. The others said their goodbyes with distracted hugs and waves, already thinking about work and errands and whatever else filled their lives beyond this home. No one lingered to help. When the house was quiet again, I stood at the sink, hands wet, the sponge limp in my palm. I stared at the dark window above the faucet, watching my own reflection fade into the night. I whispered extra mouth, just to hear how it sounded when spoken aloud. And suddenly something cracked. Not loud, not violent, just a soft final break, like the sound of a thread snapping after being pulled too tightly for too long. He didn't mean it, maybe. Maybe it was just a joke, a careless comment. But the truth is, jokes reveal more than confessions ever do. And that night his words laid bare something I had long tried to ignore. I wasn't loved. I was endured. That was the night the wedding fund stopped being a gift. It started becoming a question, a mirror, a decision I hadn't yet made but would. I've always believed the deepest wounds don't bleed. They don't scream. They bruise, and they do it quietly beneath the surface, where no one looks. That Sunday, his words left one of those bruises, and the days that followed only deepened it. It wasn't just the comment, it was everything that came after, or rather everything that didn't come. No apology, no glance in my direction. He went about the next day humming to himself while reading the newspaper, like he hadn't just reduced my existence to a math problem he couldn't solve. The rest of the family didn't mention it either. My daughter texted me something about returning Tupperware. My grandson sent a meme. Life moved forward, dragging my pain behind it, like an old suitcase with a broken wheel. But the bruise kept pulsing, showing itself in places I hadn't expected. At the grocery store, when I reached for the store brand crackers and thought, why do I still choose the cheaper one when I'm the only one who notices? At the pharmacy, when I hesitated over the joint cream I needed, but put it back on the shelf. At night, when I laid beside him in bed and realized I was turning away, not out of comfort, but out of habit, to shield myself from his indifference. The worst part came 4 days later, at the community center's charity event. We were at a table with neighbors' couples we've known for years. We all wore our Sunday best, and I had ironed his shirt that morning, though he didn't notice. I hadn't meant to go, honestly, but when you've lived a life of attending things together, you show up even when you no longer want to. At the buffet table, someone asked how we were doing, just casual small talk, and he chuckled again, that same dry laugh that used to feel like home, but now sounded like sandpaper. Well, he said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, I keep saying I should have retired alone. Would have saved me a fortune in food and drama. There it was again. That same blade slipped between my ribs with the kind of accuracy only someone who once loved you could manage. Everyone laughed. Not cruelly, just politely. That awful, uncomfortable chuckle that people offer when they don't want to choose sides. No one said, hey, that's not right. No one turned to see my face. And I smiled. I've mastered that smile, thin, practiced like a ribbon tied too tightly around something broken. I excused myself to the restroom. The mirror in there was unforgiving bright, with fluorescent lighting. I looked older under those lights, tired, sunken, stretched thin by years of being everyone's support beam. I stared into my own eyes and whispered, stop smiling. Just that, a command, a plea. Because something inside me had begun to stir. Not anger, not yet, but awareness. I had spent decades pouring into others, expecting nothing and accepting crumbs when I deserved banquets. I had chalked it up to humility, to love, to what good women do. But now it all felt like a trick I had played on myself. He didn't even notice I was gone for 20 minutes. When I returned to the table, he was mid-story about some neighbor's plumbing disaster, laughing as though I didn't exist. I sat down quietly, folded my napkin across my lap, and something inside me quietly, firmly said, "No more." That bruise, invisible as it was, had a shape now. It had language. And the most dangerous thing about pain is when it becomes coherent, when it finally teaches you how to speak its name. That night, I opened the wedding fund ledger, the one I had kept for years tucked behind my recipe books. I ran my fingers over the entries: $20 from skipping lunch, from mending old clothes, $50 from canceling my hair appointment. Each line was a sentence in a story I had written alone. And suddenly I wasn't sure if the ending should still be a gift. There's a certain ritual to being invisible that people rarely talk about. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens over years in quiet ways, by always taking the smallest piece of cake, the seat nearest the kitchen, the last cold cup of tea. It happens when you tell yourself it's okay to go, without just so someone else doesn't have to. I've lived a lifetime of choosing last, and that Sunday dinner was only the latest proof of it. Even as a girl, I learned that love often looked like shrinking. I watched my own mother slice a single apple into 5 thin wedges so her children could eat. I watched her sew her old blouses into pillowcases, never once calling it sacrifice. And somehow I grew up believing that womanhood meant giving in secret. So I followed her. I became the kind of mother who scraped the burnt rice from the bottom of the pot and called it my favorite part. The kind who waited until everyone else had filled their plates, then took what was left. I didn't resent it, not then. I took pride in the quiet, in the unseen. But over time, something happens when you're always eating the scraps, not just from the plate, but from life. You begin to believe that's what you're worth. I remember a Thanksgiving when I spent 8 hours in the kitchen. I roasted the turkey, glazed the carrots, made the cranberry sauce from real berries, because I knew my daughter hated the canned kind. I set the table with the good china, even ironed the napkins. When dinner began, I watched them eat, really watched. And when my husband reached for seconds without even acknowledging the effort, when no one asked if I had sat down yet, I realized I was only visible when I was serving. This pattern played out again and again. I became the woman who was always so strong, so dependable, so selfless, as if those were badges of honor, not signs of erosion. People praised my endurance without ever wondering why I had to endure so much in the first place. It's a quiet kind of breaking. And recently I began to wonder, what if I had taken the bigger piece of cake? What if I had said, actually, I want the window seat, or I'd like to choose the restaurant this time? Or, no, I'm not okay with that. Would they have listened? Or would they have looked at me confused, like I'd stepped out of character? Even the wedding fund, my greatest act of devotion, was born from this habit of self-erasure. Every dollar I saved came from choosing less for myself. It never felt unfair then. But now, knowing how easily they dismiss me, I wonder, why did I spend so many years starving my own joy? There's a memory that keeps resurfacing. It was late one night years ago. I had made stew hearty and thick, his favorite. But he came home from work grumbling about a bad day, barely touched his bowl, and made a passing remark that it was too salty. I remember nodding and apologizing. But when he left the room, I tasted the stew again. It wasn't salty. It was perfect. That night I cried while washing the pot, not because he had criticized me, but because I had believed him, because I always believed them. And now, sitting in this house, surrounded by the echoes of their needs and their hunger and their taking, I find myself looking differently at what remains. At the cracked plates, the dull knives, the cabinet of Tupperware with mismatched lids. I look at the pantry, where I still stock their favorites, even though they rarely visit. There's no gratitude anymore, only expectation. And when someone calls me generous, I want to laugh, as if generosity is a choice, not a survival strategy for women like me. So yes, I've been feeding them for decades, and now they call me an extra mouth. That phrase keeps circling in my mind like a vulture. I used to believe that love meant feeding others, but love, real love, feeds you back. And I'm starving. I remember the first time she said the words, "my dream wedding." She was 17, sitting on the porch steps with a notebook in her lap, sketching out centerpieces made of peonies and eucalyptus, the kind of flowers that wilt quickly but smell like a fairy tale. She looked up at me with eyes so full of light, as if the world had never hurt her, as if the world couldn't. And I smiled, not just because of what she said, but because I knew I had already started saving for it. I'd been putting away bills and coins since she was 10, quietly, relentlessly. She never asked me to. That's the thing. This wasn't about obligation. It was about love, the kind that is invisible until the day it's revealed. Every time I slipped a $5 bill into that tea tin, I was tucking away a part of my heart. When her voice changed from girlish wonder to grown woman planning, I began refining the goal. Venue costs, dress fittings, floral arrangements. I researched it all late at night, cross-legged on the couch with a notepad and calculator while he snored beside me. She didn't know that when I passed on updating my glasses for another year, that money went to the wedding fund. She didn't know that I clipped coupons with obsessive precision, or that I'd quietly sell the occasional homemade quilt or knitted scarf to add an extra $40 here and there. My hands ached, my eyes strained, but it felt worth it. It felt holy. I had no inheritance to give, no land, no family jewels, but I could give her beauty. I could give her that one perfect day where everything felt just right. And the irony, the bitter one, is that the man I married never noticed. The same man who once wrote me poems in blue ink. The man who promised to build a life with me, not on me. He sat in his chair each evening while I cooked and cleaned and schemed and saved, and now he has the gall to say, "I'm an extra mouth." I wonder if he ever noticed the worn state of my coat, the one with the hem I stitched 3 times rather than replacing. I wonder if he ever asked why I stopped buying my favorite tea, or why I wore the same shoes until the sole thinned out like paper. It wasn't martyrdom. I wasn't waiting for applause. I just truly believed that love meant doing what no one asked you to do, because that's the kind of love I was raised on. But lately I've started questioning it. What does it say about a family, a home, when the quietest devotion is the first thing forgotten, when the one who holds everything together is the one they can so easily cast aside? She still talks about the wedding like a dream. Just last week, she showed me a Pinterest board with candlelit tables and vintage china. She beamed, and I nodded, because that's what I do. I nodded, and she never once asked how any of it would be paid for. I think part of her assumes there will be help, that somehow things will work out, that I'll be there to fix the gaps as I always have. And maybe I would have. But then I hear his voice again, that offhand remark tossed like a rock into still water, an extra mouth to feed, and suddenly I wonder, why am I the one carrying dreams in my pocket while they carry on with their lives, as if I owe them this? The wedding fund was always supposed to be a secret blessing, but now it feels like a test, a measure of how far I've stretched myself thin for people who don't see the fabric fraying. I used to believe that one day she'd open that envelope, read the numbers on the check, and cry with gratitude, that maybe she'd say, "I never knew, Mom. Thank you." But what if she doesn't? What if she just accepts it like the meals, the advice, the babysitting, without ever wondering where it came from? It's not resentment I feel. Not quite. It's something older, something quieter, like a tide slowly receding from a shore. It's washed over for too long. I still want her to have a beautiful wedding, but not at the cost of my dignity. Not if it confirms what they've all begun to believe, that I exist only to give. So I look at the account balance, and I feel both pride and sorrow, because the money is there, but I'm no longer sure they deserve it. There was a time when I wore lipstick, not for anyone else, just for me. A soft, plum color, nothing too bold, but enough to feel like a whisper of elegance on days when life felt like drudgery. I used to swipe it on before starting the laundry, as if the ritual made the folding softer, the rinse cycles shorter. It reminded me that I was still a woman, underneath all the roles: wife, mother, caretaker. But one day I stopped, not because I ran out, not because I made a decision. I simply stopped. The tube rolled to the back of the drawer, lost among bobby pins and receipts, and no one noticed, not even me. It's strange, the little things that fade. I used to dye my hair every 6 weeks like clockwork. Ash brown, just enough to chase the gray away. Then when the box dye felt too expensive, I let the roots grow in. No one commented, not even when the gray took over. It was as if the change in me mirrored how they saw me fading, forgettable, functional. My birthdays, too, became quieter over the years. At first there were cards, homemade ones with crayon scrawls, then store-bought ones with a $10 bill tucked inside. Eventually, a text message. One year they forgot entirely. That one still stings. He forgot too, though I pretended not to care. He kissed my cheek that morning like any other and went out to run errands. When he returned, he had a sandwich for himself and nothing for me. I watched him eat it, in front of the television, mustard on his lip, never once realizing the date. I lit my own candle that night on a day-old muffin and whispered happy birthday into the silence. It isn't just the big betrayals that break a woman. It's the daily erosion, the slow forgetting of who you were before your name became mom, before your days were measured and meals cooked and towels folded. I remember a time I wore perfume, soft, powdery floral. I wore it before he came home from work, just to feel like I still had a secret something for me. But it ran out one winter, and I told myself we couldn't afford another bottle. That was 12 years ago. I think of all the ways I've denied myself. I stopped buying hardcover books and got used to secondhand paperbacks. I stopped browsing for dresses. I stopped painting my nails. Each tiny no to myself added up brick by brick into the wall I live behind now. People look at women like me and call it aging, but it's not that, not really. It's vanishing. And the worst part, they don't do it maliciously. They just forget. They forget you had dreams, that you once wanted to see Italy, that you liked jazz, that you hated the way mint tastes, that you once danced in the rain with bare feet and a bottle of wine in your hand. Now they hand you the baby to watch. They ask what's for dinner. They leave their mess on the counter because they know you'll clean it, and they think you're happy. But what they see as strength is silence. What they call reliability is resignation. And all this time, while I let go of perfume, lipstick, birthdays, and self-respect, I never once touched the wedding fund. That little account remained sacred, even as I let myself slip away. Until now. Because now I wonder, why should she have her dream when mine was allowed to wither? Why should they toast champagne under chandeliers, bought with my sacrifice, when I haven't even had a proper cake on my birthday in 10 years? I don't want revenge, that's not it. I just want balance, a recognition that I existed, that I mattered, that the woman who once wore plum lipstick still lives here somewhere under the layers of yes, of course, and don't worry about me. So maybe it's time I buy a new tube. Maybe not for him, not even for her. Maybe just for me. There's a drawer in the kitchen that sticks when it rains. The wood swells just enough to resist, like even it has grown weary from years of service. I kept the ledger in that drawer buried beneath pot holders and loose batteries and receipts for appliances long since broken. No one would have thought to look there. It was the one thing that truly belonged to me. The cover is soft, now worn thin at the corners. It used to be navy blue, my favorite color, and on the first page in small, careful handwriting I wrote, "For her someday." It wasn't a detailed accounting, not at first, just a date and an amount. February 8th, $10 birthday cash from Aunt Ruth. March 3rd, $5 grocery coupon saved. April 12th, $20 returned a blouse. Page after page of choices I made that no one noticed, that no one would have even thought to ask about. But I remembered. I wrote everyone down, because writing it made it real, made it feel like I was building something, not just money, but a future, a gift, something with a ribbon tied tightly around years of invisible love. Some entries still make me smile. June 14th, 59. Sold strawberry jam at bake sale. I remember that day. It was hot and sticky, and the jars kept fogging up, but people loved my jam. Someone asked for the recipe. I didn't give it. Some things are meant to stay sacred. And then there are the harder entries. October 2nd, $50 canceled eye exam. December 10th, $30 wore old winter coat. May 28th, $100 skipped trip to reunion. Each line tells a story, each one a quiet moment of me choosing her future over my present, and all of it done silently. I never told my husband about the ledger, never told my daughter. In some strange way, it felt like a love letter. And love letters don't need to be read to be true. They just need to be written. But now, looking at those pages with the hindsight of hurt, the ink starts to blur. Not from tears, though they do come, but from the knowing, the heavy, irreversible knowing that all this quiet effort might never be understood. I used to imagine giving her the ledger, maybe on the morning of her wedding, tucked inside a wooden box with the envelope of money and a note. "This was all for you." I thought maybe she'd read it and see me not just as her mother, but as a woman, a person, someone who gave from the marrow of her bones and never asked for applause. But what if she doesn't? What if she flips through it and sees only numbers? What if he sees it and calls it dramatic or unnecessary, the way he does every time I dare to feel more than convenience allows? What if no one sees the poetry in it? Because that's what this ledger is, poetry, not in rhyme but in rhythm, in the heartbeat behind every decision, in the meals stretched with lentils, in the clothes hung to dry to save electricity, in the birthdays skipped the nights spent mending instead of sleeping. It's strange. I always thought this ledger would make me feel proud, and in some ways it still does. But tonight, as I hold it in my lap, and run my hand across the pages like I'm smoothing the creases in my own soul, I feel something else, loneliness. Because this ledger, this proof of devotion, has never been read, not once. And suddenly that makes it feel less like a gift and more like a diary, one that I wrote to a version of her that may no longer exist. She's older now, busier, caught up in her own world as she should be. But still, I wonder, if she had seen this ledger before he called me an extra mouth, would she have said something? Would she have remembered the jam, the coat, the skipped reunions, or would she, like everyone else, smile politely and change the subject? I close the book gently. The cover sighs. There's still time to decide what to do with it. but I know this much: I will not let it be buried again. Because I am tired of burying myself. I didn't mean to overhear him. I wasn't eavesdropping. It was just one of those moments where the universe tilts and lets you see something you were never meant to. I was in the hallway folding laundry, trying to work the stiffness out of a fitted sheet that refused to behave. The living room window was open, and through it floated his voice, calm, familiar, and indifferent, in that way that only long marriages allow. He was leaning over the fence, chatting with our neighbor, the kind of harmless small talk that men retire into weather lawns, the rising cost of everything. They were laughing about bills, about how wives love to spend, and then, like he was saying something clever, he shrugged and said, "Well, she's just part of the overhead now. You know how it is, not much use these days, but what can you do?" The neighbor laughed, a friendly, complicit sound, the kind men use to avoid discomfort. I didn't drop the laundry. I didn't gasp or storm into the yard. I just stood there, hands full of warm cotton, a sock slipping from my grip like something being slowly let go of. Not much use. It rang in my ears louder than it should have, but maybe that's because it wasn't new. Not really. It was just the first time he said it aloud to someone else with no shame. There was a time I used to be useful. I was the keeper of calendars, the planner of meals, the finder of keys, and missing shoes, and lost homework. I was the nurse during fevers, the therapist during breakups, the quiet protector when tempers flared, and I did it all without a title, without asking for credit. Because love, I thought, was meant to be invisible. But now I'm a fixture, a background presence, a spare wife. He doesn't touch me unless it's to tap my shoulder when I've fallen asleep in my chair. He doesn't ask how I feel, doesn't ask what I need. If I disappeared for a day, I wonder if he'd notice, or if he'd assume I was out buying more toothpaste or feeding the neighbor's cat. That night I sat on the edge of our bed, while he snored behind me, and I stared at my feet, old feet, tired feet, the kind that know the coolness of kitchen tile at 5 a.m., better than they know carpeted rest. I thought of all the floors they had walked across school hallways for parent-teacher meetings, hospital corridors for emergency visits, supermarket aisles where I debated brands by the price per ounce. I thought of all the steps I had taken to serve this family and how little of it remained. No medals, no poems, just a quiet ache in my knees and a man who calls me overhead. There is a point in every woman's life where she realizes the pedestal she thought she was building is actually a shelf they put her on when they were done needing her. The next morning, I didn't speak to him. I made the coffee. I folded the paper the way he likes. I placed the butter dish to the left of the toast, not the right. And still, I was a ghost in the room. But inside something was starting to burn. Not anger, something older, a kind of awakening. Because I knew something he didn't. I wasn't just a spare wife. I was the architect of every comfort he took for granted. The clothes he wore, I mended those. The meals he devoured, I seasoned them with memories. The roof above his head, I helped build it piece by invisible piece. And I had something he had forgotten about, something he thought didn't matter. I had the wedding fund. $12,860. That's how much was still there. More than enough to make a difference. More than enough to leave. I used to love the early hours, when the house was still and even the floorboards seemed to breathe a little softer. I'd wake before anyone else and move through the kitchen with quiet purpose, warming water for tea, slicing fruit with slow intention. It felt sacred then, a time that belonged only to me. But lately the mornings have changed. They're not mine anymore. They belong to a mind that won't stop spinning a body too tired to rise, but too tense to rest. That night, after hearing him call me, part of the overhead sleep wouldn't come. I lay still in our bed, his back turned, his snores steady, and stared at the ceiling fan as it spun slow circles above us. It was dark but not quiet. The silence had weight. It pressed down on me like an unwelcome blanket, and the more I tried to ignore it, the louder the memories became. I thought about the time he hurt his back, and I rubbed ointment into his spine every night for a week without complaint. I remembered how I sat through endless budget meetings and boring social events, always smiling politely beside him, a decorative piece no one asked questions of. I thought about the wedding fund again, how sacred it once felt, a beacon, a secret joy. Now it felt like a rope in my hand, and I had to choose tie it into a bow or cut myself free. I sat up slowly and slipped my feet into the slippers by my bed, the ones with the worn soles, the little patch at the toe. I padded through the house past photos of smiling faces that once meant everything. At the kitchen table, I turned on only the small light above the sink and sat with my thoughts. And then I whispered a question aloud softly, like it might shatter if spoken too clearly. Why am I still here? I wasn't asking why I was awake. I wasn't even asking why I was in this kitchen, this home, this life. I was asking why I had stayed in a place where I had become background noise, where my presence was unacknowledged unless something went missing or broke or needed cleaning. It's not that I wanted to leave. I wanted it to matter that I stayed. I looked around the room and saw my imprint everywhere, the curtains I sewed from discount fabric, the chipped mug that only I used, the calendar with everyone's birthdays except mine. I opened the drawer with the ledger again, ran my hand over the spine. I thought about all the other women like me, wives, mothers, grandmothers, whose lives were measured not in milestones, but in meals made and crises averted, whose names were said only when something was forgotten or needed fixing. I got up and walked to the back door, opened it, let the cold night air brush my skin. It smelled of wet grass and something else, something electric, like change. I stood there for a long time breathing, not to calm myself, but to feel myself, to remember that I had a body-lungs breath, that I was not just hands and lists and tired smiles. Back inside, I sat again, and I made a decision. Not a loud one, not an angry one, but the kind of decision that lives deep inside the bones, one that says, no more. No more waiting to be seen, no more giving until I disappear. The wedding fund would not be spent on a celebration that no longer felt like a gift. It wouldn't buy lace or flowers or a seat at a table where I'd be forgotten again. It would buy me something else. Not revenge, not drama. Freedom. The next morning, the sun came up like it always does, golden, predictable, indifferent. He was still asleep when I slipped out the door, coat-buttoned high gloves hiding the shake in my hands. The chill in the air was sharp, but I welcomed it. It reminded me I was alive, that I could still feel, that I wasn't just a shadow moving through someone else's life. I walked instead of driving. I wanted the air, the silence, the time. Every step echoed like a question. Are you really doing this? And every answer was quieter, but firmer. Yes, yes. I walked past the bakery where I used to buy her birthday cakes, past the bookstore I hadn't gone into in years, past the shop that used to sell perfume I could no longer justify. All the ghosts of who I used to be waved quietly from windows I didn't look into. When I arrived at the bank, I sat on the bench outside for a moment. My pulse was fast. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the gravity of it, or maybe it was simply the unfamiliar taste of choosing myself. Inside it smelled sterile and safe. The woman at the counter smiled polite and brisk. "How can I help you today?" I swallowed and pulled the little slip from my coat pocket. the account number, the one I had guarded like a secret for decades. "I'd like to withdraw the full amount," I said. She blinked, all of it. "Yes," I said, and surprised myself with how steady my voice sounded. She clicked her nails against the keyboard. "That'll take a few minutes." "I can wait," I said. "I've been waiting for years." She left to prepare the cash, and I sat there, hands in my lap, heartbeats slow and loud in my chest. I looked around at the tidy little room. Posters about savings plans, retirement accounts. None of them showed women like me. They showed young couples and confident businessmen, never the ones who did the quiet saving, the invisible work. She returned with an envelope heavy with bills. It didn't look like much, thinner than I imagined. But when she passed it across the counter, I felt a strange power move through me. The weight of it was not in the money, it was in the decision, the reclaiming. "Would you like to close the account?" she asked. I paused, then nodded. There was no ceremony, no music, no applause, just a keystroke, a record deleted, an ending as quiet as the years it took to build. I stepped out into the street and stood still for a long moment, envelope clutched in my hand. The cars passed, the world kept moving, but something inside me had stopped spinning. I didn't know what I would do with the money yet, not exactly, but I knew what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't hand it over to people who saw me as a convenience. I wouldn't fund a celebration I'd likely be seated in the corner of wearing a recycled dress and a forced smile. That money wasn't just a fund. It was my voice, my time, my small resistances and unspoken dreams. It was me. And now it was mine again. I walked home slower, taking the long way, just to feel the pavement beneath my feet. Past the school she used to attend, where I'd waited outside in the rain more times than I could count. Past the park where I once taught her how to ride a bike. Past the little antique shop I used to dream of opening, but never did. When I got home, he was still in his robe, sipping coffee, flipping through the paper. "Where'd you go?" he asked, not looking up. "Just out," I said. He didn't ask more, and I didn't offer. The envelope was in my purse, zipped tight, resting quietly like a secret weapon, like a letter I had finally decided to mail to myself after all these years. That afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the mirror longer than usual, not the quick glance I'd gotten used to in recent years, checking only for stains on my sweater or loose threads at the collar. No, this time I really looked. I saw the lines around my eyes, not as something to fix, but as something earned. I saw the gray streaks in my hair, uneven and uncombed, and thought not of covering them, but of how long it had taken me to stop caring about covering anything at all. I studied my face inch by inch, and for the first time in a very long while, I didn't look away. I didn't see a burden. I didn't see an extra mouth. I saw someone who had been left behind but never left, someone who had given and given and given without ever demanding that her giving be acknowledged. I saw someone who had stayed when no one said thank you, when no one remembered her birthday, when the wedding fund was quietly built from the bones of her own denial. I saw the woman who'd kissed scraped knees, calmed family storms, and managed to find peace in folding laundry while the world rushed around her. And I spoke. Not loudly, not bitterly, just clearly. "You're still here," I said softly, "and you're not nothing." I don't know what came over me then, but I smiled. A real one, sad, tired, but somehow proud. I opened my drawer and found the old lipstick, the plum one. It was dry, cracked at the edges, but I applied it anyway. A defiant little smear of color across lips that had stayed quiet for far too long. It looked strange at first, almost theatrical, but then I tilted my head and thought, no, this is who I used to be. And that version of me, she wasn't gone, just buried under everyone else's needs. I brushed my hair, changed my blouse, even put on earrings, tiny pearls that hadn't seen the light in over a decade. And for no one but me, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and that envelope of money in front of me. It was time to make a plan. Not a dramatic one. I wasn't going to torch bridges or scream into phones. That's not my way. But I would not remain silent. Not anymore. I picked up a notepad and wrote one word at the top: options. Because now I had them. A hotel for a few days just to be away. A train ticket. A rented cottage by the sea. A donation. A trust in my name. Anything that served me, that mirrored back all that I had been giving. I didn't need to spend it all. I just needed to choose where it went. And perhaps more importantly, where it didn't. I imagined her wedding day tables dressed in white flowers spilling out of silver vases, a band playing softly in the background. I imagined myself seated at the very edge, away from the photographs, far from the speech givers. And I imagined standing up calmly, walking to the door and not being missed. That wasn't a fantasy. That was a memory waiting to happen. One I now had the power to rewrite. This was not about punishment. This was about recentering. About no longer pouring into people who treated my love like tap water, always there, always flowing, never questioned. It was time I poured something back into myself. Because this woman in the mirror, she wasn't just a mother, or a wife, or a caretaker. She was a person, and she had worth. It was a simple note, just a few lines written on linen paper, with the fountain pen I used to keep for special things, birthdays, anniversaries, letters I never sent. My handwriting was careful, measured, almost formal. As though I was writing not just words, but the ending of a story I had spent too long trying to rewrite with invisible ink. The note read, "I've withdrawn the wedding fund. It will no longer be available. Please make plans accordingly." There was no anger in it, no lecture, no drama, just clarity. I folded it once and placed it on the kitchen table just beneath the salt shaker. I knew they'd come by later that evening, my daughter and her fiancé, for dinner. I had already cooked the stew. I still did those things even when I shouldn't. Habit can be hard to kill. When they arrived, they were laughing something about cake flavors and centerpiece arguments. She breezed into the kitchen, kissed my cheek absently, and went straight to her phone. He gave me a nod, then opened the fridge without asking. I didn't say a word. Dinner was served. We ate, they talked, I listened. And then, as plates were cleared and I reached for the sponge as always, she picked up the note. I saw her face change slowly, like sunlight fading behind a cloud. She read it twice, once in confusion, then in disbelief. "Mom," she said, voice high and trembling, "what is this?" I didn't turn. I rinsed a plate, wiped a fork, let the sound of running water fill the space between us like a wall. "It means what it says," I replied gently. "But why, I thought—" She stopped. She didn't finish the sentence. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she realized how many assumptions were built into that "I thought." "I know," I said. "You thought I would always give, without asking, without being seen. You thought I didn't need anything back." She opened her mouth again, but I raised a hand, not in anger, just in pause. "You never asked where the money came from," I continued. "You never asked what it cost me. And I never told you. That's on me. I thought it would mean more if it was a surprise, if it came wrapped in quiet love." I turned then, looked her in the eyes. But now I see what's quiet is often overlooked, and I won't be overlooked anymore. Her fiancé stepped forward, voice defensive. "This seems unfair. You knew she was planning around that money." I looked at him calmly. "Did either of you ever plan around me? Silence. A long one. The kind that shifts a room's foundation. I'm not doing this out of spite, I said. I'm doing it because I've realized that love should not erase the lover. And I've been erased long enough. She started to cry. I didn't comfort her. I couldn't not this time. Because those tears were built on a fantasy that I had helped construct, and now I was tearing it down gently, but fully. I still love you, I said. But this money, it's not yours. It never was. It was a gift I was building, and now I'm choosing a different recipient. What are you going to do with it? She whispered. I don't know yet, I said, but I know it will be something that feeds me, that reminds me I exist. They left soon after, quiet and stunned. No yelling, no slamming of doors, just the soft rustle of coats and shoes and unspoken words. When the door closed behind them, I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table I had once imagined decorating with white linens and wedding favors and a 3-tiered cake. Instead, it held a single mug of tea and the sound of my own breath. I wasn't sad. I was finally clear. The house was still the next morning, still in that way that almost feels sacred, like after a storm has passed and everything is holding its breath. I walked from room to room without rushing, touching the furniture, the curtains, the corners of picture frames, as though I was saying goodbye, not to things, but to versions of myself. I opened the old chest at the foot of the bed. Inside were the clothes I'd kept for occasions, the nice cardigan with the pearl buttons, the silk blouse I wore to her graduation, the black skirt I hadn't worn since my sister's funeral. I folded them slowly, carefully, as though each thread deserved a blessing. With every item I packed, I felt lighter. Not because I was running away, but because I was walking towards something for the first time in years. Something that was mine, not borrowed, not shared, not assigned. In the closet tucked beneath my winter coats was a suitcase I hadn't used since before we started calling vacations too expensive and maybe next year. I pulled it out and placed it on the bed. The zipper stuck a little at first, like it too had forgotten what it felt like to open. I packed slowly, deliberately. Not just clothes, but pieces of my silence, years of swallowing words and smoothing tension. I folded it all into fabric. Each pair of socks, each scarf, each sweater felt like another memory lifted off my chest. There was a drawer in the bathroom with my things, though no one else ever went in there. A small hand mirror, a bottle of lotion with barely enough for one more day, a bar of soap that smelled like lavender. I packed those too. I even slipped in the old tube of plum lipstick, cracked but still brave. I paused before taking the ledger. It sat on my nightstand, a quiet witness to everything I'd lived and chosen and lost. I held it in my hands for a long time. Then I placed it carefully on top of my clothes like a final seal on a time capsule. There were no tears, not even when I passed the hallway where the photos hung. Wedding, birthdays, holidays, all the curated moments we framed to trick ourselves into thinking love is permanent. I didn't take the photos down. I didn't need to. The woman in those pictures, the one smiling while holding cakes and babies and casseroles, she was coming with me. Not the image, the spirit. I didn't leave a note. I had already said what I needed to say. The rest would unfold on its own with or without my help. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom for one last look, the bed unmade, the curtains catching a soft breeze, his slippers by the edge slightly crooked just as he left them. I didn't feel regret. I felt release. Downstairs, I made a cup of tea, not for anyone else, just for me. I drank it standing by the window, watching the sky shift from dull gray to something warmer, softer, as if even the day was giving me its blessing. When the last sip was gone, I washed the cup, dried it, and set it back on the shelf. Then I picked up the suitcase, smoothed my coat, and opened the door. No one saw me leave. No one stopped me. There was no slam, no scream, no cinematic music. Just the soft thud of the door closing behind me and the sound of my own steps on the walkway, steady, purposeful, alive. I didn't know exactly where I was going yet. A small inn, maybe. A week by the sea. A room with a window that faced something other than the life I had outgrown. But I knew this. I wasn't packing a suitcase. I was unpacking myself from all the roles I'd worn like heavy coats in summer. And in their place I carried one thing only: quiet. But not the kind of quiet that bruises. The kind that heals. The morning I left the house was still asleep. Even the birds outside the window seemed to sense the change and sang more softly, as though trying not to wake what no longer needed waking. I moved slowly, not out of fear but reverence, like walking through the last pages of a book I had already decided to close. He lay in bed, mouth slightly open, one arm flung over the pillow where I used to rest my head. I watched him for a moment, not with love, not with bitterness, just observation. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe I had simply never looked closely enough. Age had crept into both of us, but only one of us had noticed. I didn't leave a note, not because I was being cruel, but because sometimes silence says more than explanations ever could. My suitcase was already in the car. I had packed light, only what I needed, only what belonged to me. I didn't bring the family albums. I didn't bring the silverware he insisted we keep from his mother's house. I didn't bring the little clock he liked on the mantel. I brought the ledger. I brought the plum lipstick. I brought the quiet. As I stepped out the front door, I didn't look back. Not once. I didn't need to. I knew that if I turned around, I'd start seeing ghosts again. The woman who waited too long. The girl who believed patience would be repaid. The mother who thought sacrifice was love's only language. But I was not a ghost. I was flesh and breath and choice. The air outside was crisp, the kind that bites just enough to make you feel awake, alive. I pulled my coat tighter, not because I was cold, but because I wanted to savor the sensation. The streets were mostly empty, just a few early risers walking dogs, or jogging with earbuds in. No one looked at me. And yet, for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not by them, but by myself. I stopped at the cafe on the corner, the one I used to pass without entering, the one I told myself was too expensive or too indulgent. But today I walked in, sat at a window seat, ordered tea in the warm scone with jam. And when the plate arrived, I didn't wait for anyone. I didn't offer to share. I didn't cut it in half and push the bigger piece across the table. I picked up my fork, took a bite, and chewed slowly, as if it were the first meal of my life made solely for me. Outside, the city stirred to life. Inside, I sat quietly watching light stretch across the sidewalk, watching the steam rise from my cup. No one called, no one texted. And I didn't check. I didn't miss them. I missed me. And now finally, fully, I was here. I don't know what comes next, not exactly, but I've stopped waiting for someone else to write the ending for me. Maybe I'll travel. Maybe I'll rent a little apartment near the water and read books all day. Maybe I'll walk every morning and learn how to breathe again without the weight of a house that never once said thank you. I don't need a map. I just need stillness and maybe a bit of soft music, the kind that doesn't rush anywhere, that just exists like a companion to your breath. Because I'm not angry, not anymore. I'm not chasing apologies. I'm not trying to make them understand. That's not peace. That's a performance. Real peace comes like this, with long pauses, warm tea, soft shoes, with a suitcase that holds only what matters. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to slam the door. I just needed to remember my worth. Some endings are really beginnings, just with the noise turned off. And I gave them silence, and in it I found me.